Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Susan Huang. I teach at Rice University. It's a great pleasure to have this hybrid event. Our special guest speaker is Sonya Lee from USC. Dr. Sonya Lee is professor of art history, East Asian languages of cultures, and religion at the University of Southern California. She is currently director of East Asian Studies Center and chair of the Department of East Asian Languages and Cultures. Dr. Lee has published widely on Buddhist material culture of China and Central Asia. She's the author of Temples in Cliffside, Buddhist art of Hechuan. It just come out from University of Washington Press in 2021. And her first book was Surviving Nirvana, Death of the Buddha in Chinese Visual Culture, published by Hong Kong University Press in 2010. Dr. Lee is also editor-in-chief for the Grove Art Online, the premier online resource for the visual arts administered by Oxford University Press. Dr. Lee's research interests include the material culture of the ancient Silk Road, Buddhist sacred geography, art and ecology, heritage conservation, and collecting and display of Asian art in museums. Her current new book project brings perspectives from new materialism and post-humanism into the study of the art and technology of wall paintings of the Silk Road. Today, we are so honored for her to visit Rice, and we have a substantial group of audience on Zoom as well. The topic of her talk is what can restoring colossal Buddhas do for nature conservancy and cultural preservation. Let's welcome Dr. Lee.
Hello, everybody. Can you hear me in the back? Great. First of all, I'd like to thank the Department of Transnational Asia for inviting me to be part of this lecture series. I also like to thank Professor Susan Huang for being such a wonderful host, and also the faculty and staff in the department. I really am grateful for this opportunity to share my research with you today, and I look forward to questions and comments you have after my talk. And I try to end in about 45 to 50 minutes so that there's time for discussion. Is that how you forward? Oh. Okay, thank you. So the removal and at times violent destruction of public monuments has been in the news lately. The Confederate monuments that you see in the screen from Charlottesville are an example that many of you in the audience are familiar with. My talk today will focus on the other side of the same point, namely the restoration of public monuments. But the monuments I will be discussing today are not statues of public political figures placed in front of government buildings or in the public parks. Rather, they are religious icons carved out of mountain cliff faces far away from urban center. So the screen you're seeing here try to make a point about this contrast. The creation of a colossal Buddha, like what you see here, was a monumental undertaking, requiring not only a large labor force, but also a steady stream of donation. Throughout history, local or regional government officials in particular are eager to sponsor this kind of project because they're interested in making use of religious devotion to advance various social, economic, and political agendas. More importantly, these images insert enormous power over the viewers, especially in articulating a certain vision of hierarchical power associated with their makers. Even though the two examples I have on the screen come from very different cultural backgrounds, they do have this in common. And I would also add that the alluring power of monumental statues continue to be recognized by later generations of users who would restore and reuse these images for their own purposes. For statues that have survived for many centuries, and in our case, over 800 or 900 years, there are other factors contributing to their remarkable longevity besides the effective power inherent in the category of colossal statuary. The examples I will discuss today all share one in common, namely their embeddedness within nature. So at a place called Reveres Monastery, or the Second Buddha Monastery in a city in southwest China, Hechuan. This is a site that I will spend quite a bit of time discussing later on. There is a colossal Buddha over 13 meters or over 40 feet high, and it's made to be part of a landscape shaped by the rivers nearby. So on the screen, I have a shot of the Buddha inside on your right, and the overall surrounding landscape from the mountain view, and also a view from the river when you on a boat traveling alongside that landscape. And the reason that I like to show you the river view is because that river, the true river, had long been the major route of transportation for hundreds of years. So this is how people would travel to this site up to the pre-modern, in pre-modern times. And I also want to highlight the trees and rocks around this particular area to underscore the statue's site specificity, which is a major characteristic of many colossal Buddhas in China, where they're often created in response to certain qualities associated with a particular place in nature. In origin stories associated with a place like this, we learned that Buddhists often took certain topographical features such as shape of a cliff face, natural phenomena such as light, mist, or some other meteorological phenomenon to be a sign of divinity, and also the very reason for founding a religious center. But what these records won't tell you is that statues will remain in the same setting for centuries to come. How exactly the monuments evolve within a complex web of ecological connections is what I'm particularly interested in exploring. The statue's long lifespan provides us with a long-term historical perspective on changes in the local environmental conditions that have bore direct impact on the monument's physical state. The statue's materiality also has a lot to tell us about the changing mindset and behavior of human users who continue to create meaning out of the site. It is the latter that I want to focus on in this talk. So how do people live and behave in a natural surrounding with religious monuments set within it? This question is quite closely related to what's frequently asked in environmental ethics. So how should humans interact with the environment and non-humans? Environmental ethics, as many of you might know, is a branch of philosophy which extends the scope of moral considerability to non-human nature. Driven by a sense of crisis and an activist agenda, many writers in this field deem anthropocentrism, or the focus on human beings, to be at the roots of many problems we face today. To find solutions, it was as imperative to rethink the human relationship with animals, plants, and the non-living environment. It is also important to note that environmental ethics as a field emerged in a time when scientists who study nature were not satisfied with doing research alone, but were also determined to put the knowledge they produce into practice. They took up conserving and protecting different kinds of natural resources themselves, and also by influencing or seeking to influence government policy and pushing for different kinds of socioeconomic models to realize their vision for the planet. In order to make their work more persuasive and accessible to many people around the globe, proponents of natural conservancy had turned to the study of religion for inspiration. At the same time, scholars in religion have also actively joined the debate, as they too believe there's in fact a lot religion can do to addressing current environmental crisis. One notable trend resulting from this joining forces is comparative religious ethics, which explores ecological issues from the perspective of diverse religious faiths. In the emergent field of what's called religio-environmental ethics, the question now becomes, how should humans interact with the environment and non-humans, which is based on religious convictions, values, and norms? As you can see, what historians of religion try to do is to understand how humans throughout the ages have framed the meaning of nature in terms of religious narratives and practices. To step back a little bit, you may ask, why an art historian like myself talking about environmental ethics? So let me now turn to my earlier question. How do people live and behave in natural surroundings with religious monuments set within it? This in many ways builds on the very basic question in environmental ethics. But instead of animals or plants, my focus is now on man-made objects created to exist within a specific ecosystem. And the objects I study were initially created to give material form to the divine perceived in nature, and the carvings would retain the original function in the mind of many later users. Heritage conservation offers one viable venue for art historians to get involved. Specifically, it underscores a reconceptualization of art historical research as a form of historical inquiry, and at the same time, a direct pragmatic intervention into policies and practices related to those religious monuments that I study. In heritage conservation, scholars are stakeholders who do interact with other stakeholders, such as site managers, government officials, visitors, and restorers in an ongoing dialogue on what gets preserved and how to do it. Maintaining this focus on scholarship and its applicability in the real world is central to a larger aim in my newly published book. That is, this is a really great importance to bring cultural monuments into the climate debate and sustainability discourse, and explain how cultural preservation ought to be part of the solution moving forward. Art historians, I believe, can do a lot to advance this goal by demonstrating that enduring cultural monuments like cave temples, in fact, offer us invaluable lessons on how to forge a sustainable future. Like the emergence of nature conservancy movement more than half a century ago, it is time for art historians to join today's climate action and discussion with our unique scholarly contributions. So what I'm proposing in this talk is something called religio-environmental ethics through heritage conservation. And so these are the 2 points that I just highlighted. So I will spell in more concrete terms what a religio-environmental ethics through heritage conservation entails after discussing my main subject, the Earthful Monastery of Laitan, where I have done extensive research until roughly 2000, when the global pandemic shut everything down around the world. The case at hand is representative of the state of heritage conservation in post-socialist China, especially at sites that are less well-known and somewhat off the beaten track. I find these sites particularly productive to study because they really help highlight tension between the central authority and different regional interests. Now, let me say a few words about the term the post-socialist period, which might not be as familiar to many of you. Basically, it refers to the time period after the opening of China in 1976, marked by Mao Zedong's death, and also the beginning of the economic reform that ensued. As China emerged as a major economic power on the world stage from the 1990s onward, one important development to have taken place was the tremendous attention paid to historical monuments around the country. The central government took a lead by investing quite a lot of resources in taking care of the thousands of heritage properties that were designated as such since the 1950s, but did not have the resources to protect or maintain them properly until that point. By the early 2000s, some of the manufacturing industries and infrastructure developments began to cool down. Domestic tourism was seen as a viable alternative to maintain a red-hot economy that yielded double-digit GDP growth year after year. Within this context, it is interesting to note that Colossal Buddha statues continue to remain a source of fascination in this period. So we do have quite a number of brand new statues being created across the country, like what you see on the screen. So in Southwest China alone, there are quite a few. So on your left is a reclining Buddha built in a city in eastern Sichuan of Nanchong at a site called Lingyunshan in 2005. And then on your left is another really large Buddha, but it's now part of an amusement park called the Buddha Capital of the Orient. So these are brand new Buddhas being created in this period, post-socialist China. And then at the same time, we also have quite a large number of old statues built centuries ago being restored. So on the screen are two examples, and I will refer to them again. So on your left is a very well-known example at the site of Baodingshan in the Dazhu district, restored in 2015. And then on the right is a Colossal Buddha at the city of Tongnan, restored in 2012. Now, restoring a monumental statue like these, it's an enormously complex operation. So let me just walk you through very quickly what some of the steps are involved. So they usually cost hundreds of millions of yuan in operational cost, and the process of restoration is also very time consuming. As you can see, it involved multiple rounds of negotiation among the different groups of stakeholders with different worldviews and agenda. So you have government officials, experts in heritage conservation and other fields, and site managers on the one hand, who will decide on what appearance these Buddhas will take, what kind of materials and techniques to be used for the job, and how to uphold its imputed values throughout the process. And on the other hand, you have visitors, especially those from the nearby communities. They often see these projects as a nuisance. It's because when there's a restoration, the site will be closed for months, if not for years. And that will prevent them from using the site for worship. That's actually one of the main reasons why they would go to those places in the first place. But at least one positive outcome for all these groups is that once the statue is fully restored, they feel that the statue's perceived efficacy in inspiring religious devotion and civic pride will be restored as well. And so that could also be a positive development for the community as a whole. So in short, a major restoration helps bring many different stakeholders together while challenging them to reconsider what the site means to them today. And on the somewhat more negative side, these stakeholder groups will often clash with each other, and the occasion also provide researchers like me from the outside a unique opportunity to see in real time how the process unfolded in a specific time and place. So let me now turn to my example in Hechuan, the Earthful Monastery. So let me start with two maps. So the map on the left shows you China as a whole, and then within that square is Southwest China, which is basically comprised of Sichuan and Chongqing. And then if you turn to the detail on your right, I highlighted where Hechuan is located. And for many of you who are not familiar with Southwest China, you see that this is basically a place somewhat isolated from the rest of China because of the geography, and it's framed by 4 rivers. So the Yangtze River is the main one going east-west, and then you have several tributaries going north-south. And Hechuan is important because it's located in a confluence of many of these tributaries, leading to the big Yangtze River. And now I have an even bigger detail to show you where Earthful Monastery is located. So Hechuan City is where all these rivers converge. And Urvo Monastery is a little bit off from that center. It's located at the town of Laitan along the Chu River. So I mentioned earlier with the images that the Chu River was the main transportation route for centuries until very recent times. So people would go to the place by boat, not by cars. And this is where the site is located. So I first learned of the plan to restore the Colossal Buddha at Urvo Monastery in 2017. When I was doing research in Daju, the district nearby, I was there to interview conservation professionals who were involved in the early restoration of this massive thousand-arm Avalokitesvara statue at Baotingshan. So let's see. So I also learned that they were actually trying to do work at Laitan as well. So the statue, as you can see, this is a picture before the restoration. It's actually really well known in the area, as it's been a constant fixture in the life of a lot of local residents since the 12th century, so been around for 800 or 900 years. The main icon is a seated Sakyamuni Buddha, about 15 meters tall, so it's about 40-some meters tall. And it was carved out of a cliff face, as you can tell from the overview. And what's also special about this particular site, you can see is that there are also thousands of other images. And most of these images are about Chang or Zen Buddhism. And so he's on the left, it's a view going into the main building. And then on the right, the upper right is a view of what's inside that building. And then and the lower part of the screen is a plan of the entire site. And here are some of the images of these images related to Chang Buddhism. So the big statue to your far right, it's Bodhidharma, one of the patriarchs, and many monk images. Okay, so so there used to be a very large monastic community that once flourished at Urvo Monastery. This large wooden frame shelter was erected above all of these images and has been rebuilt multiple times in the past. So given its popularity in the region, the Urvo Monastery has naturally come under the watchful eyes of state and local authorities. Following the founding of the People's Republic of China, it was among the first batch of historical sites in Sichuan to be designated top priority protected heritage properties at the provincial level in 1956. And some 50 years later, it was named one of the country's important protected cultural heritage units. So it's one of the very high ranks. And the new designation prompted local officials in Hechuan to take action in order to make something of the site's growing renown within the official circle. So in 2011, the Hechuan City Investment Company, a state-run business, funded a major repair of the wooden shelter. Not long after the shelter project was completed, 2 years later, another group called the Hechuan City Development Investment began planning yet another major repair, this time involving the Colossal Buddha itself. The singular interest in restoring statue can be seen as a bandwagon response to all the similar projects in Southwest China, such as the one at Baotingshan that you see on your left, where the thousand-arm Avalokitesvara came under restoration from 2008 to 2015, and it was considered a top priority conservation project at that time. So if you pay attention to the date, 2008 was the Summer Olympic Games in China, and there was a big earthquake in China just before that. And so that got a lot of the attention by the central government. And so that project cost almost like $10 million US. So that was considered one of the most expensive and the most important projects. And so I'm trying to put all these different restoration projects within the single narrative for you to see how they're related to each other. Now, if you pay attention to these two projects, you see one of the most striking aspects of the restoration is the really bright gold color of the material added to these ancient statues. So to show you the effect, so before and after, so the Thousand of Avalokitesvara look like what you saw on the right before, and then after the restoration in 2015, that's what it looks like now. And so the gold color was really striking. So the brand new appearance formed a really big contrast with what came before. And it took the restorers nearly 3 years of research, debate, and experimentation to come to this decision to really basically redo all the services. Now to really quickly sum up why they decided to do this, one of the biggest problems at this particular location was the constant seepage of water out of the mountain cliff. So that means the spots that you see on the left constantly have water coming out. And in order for them to do a better job of protecting this place, basically they would need to stop the water, which is something very difficult, and also try to deal with the excessive amount of salt that will come out with the water. And the crystallization of salt will lead eventually to the delamination of different surfaces of the statue. So it's a really challenging scientific problem that they are facing. Now, initially, the plan was to consolidate the stone first, and then we use some of the existing gold leaves to attach to the surface. But then they realized that first they didn't have enough old gold leaves to reuse, so they have only about 20% that's reusable. So that means they really have to bring in new material, and so that's what they did. And also the technique involved in restoring something like this, it's actually has a very long history. So basically, it's a kind of gilding method using lacquer. So lacquer in pre-modern times was very widespread. So the use of this is very widespread, and it's similar to something what I would like to call the super glue in the past. So something that's very sticky that allows you to attach different kinds of material to stone. And lacquer is actually very useful in that sense. And so that's why they decided to use this traditional method again to restore these statues. Now in 2018, now going back to Hechuan, the central government gave the Hechuan City Investment the official permission to initiate the restoration project at Urval Monastery. Unlike any of the previous repairs at the site, they invited the country's top conservation researchers and professionals to carry out a project. So in the past, it's all done locally. So they invited Peking University for the archaeological survey, and also the Beijing Cultural Heritage and Traditional Architecture Engineering Company to do the consolidation and also the restoration. When I got the news that these restorers about to erect this massive scaffolding that you see on the left around the Buddha, I went to Hechuan as soon as I could in order to interview these people. I also had the opportunity to really look at the statue up close because you can do only so much with binoculars. So if you could actually climb up the scaffolding and literally not touch, but look very closely, it's a different kind of learning experience. So through all this, I realized that the gilding process is actually why it was chosen, and I also get to understand the deterioration, why it actually occurred. See the pictures. Okay. So here's some of the photos that I took up close, and you can see with the Buddha's face, for example, you can see that it's peeling off quite badly. And it's not only because of the water coming out or the salt, but in fact, it had to do with the previous restoration projects that they were actually not done properly. Like by properly, I meant in order for these kind of new gilded surfaces to last longer, first of all, you need to clean out everything on top of the stone, and then and do it layer by layer. But as you can see on the right, actually I can get the mouse to work. So if you look at this area, you can see that this is actually 2 layers of restoration. One, the darker color was an older one, and then this is the brighter color is newer. So what it meant was that they just applied the gold leaf directly on top of the old ones. So that's not very effective. And in time, the whole thing will peel off. And so that's what happened to a lot of these other places. Now, some of you might be asking why older or restorers in older times didn't do a proper job. Well, it also had a lot of other considerations because in order to do it properly, maybe they didn't have enough resources, or maybe they didn't know how to do the job. But I think they also thought about, what if you detach all the previous layers? What do you do with them? Do you just throw it in a garbage can? Since these are related to sacred objects, you can't just dispose them readily, but in fact, you have to find other ways to dispose things related to sacred objects. And maybe they didn't want to deal with it simply by attaching new pieces on top. And so restoring sacred statues like these entail all kinds of problems and considerations. So, so through all this kind of close observation, I realized that doing restoration of Colossal Buddhas, it's a lot more complicated than you think. And one thing that probably they realized, everybody in the past, that if you just use paint, it's not going to last very long because of the water and the salt. And sticking with lacquer would be a much more effective way. And this is a perfect example of what I would call the eco-compatibility in material culture or art making. So the material and the techniques need to satisfy the technical challenge posed by the local climatic conditions, while providing an aesthetics commensurate with the devotee's expectations. So you have to satisfy both the technical and the religious demands. Otherwise, the job will not be complete. And so in some way, when you look at the materiality of these colossal Buddhas, you see the whole history of the site and its continued relevance, all captured in these layers of gold leaves. So that's why I found them extremely productive in really digging into the technology and also the broader cultural context. And you can also see why restorers at Urfo Monastery also decided to stick with this particular combination of material and techniques to carry out their restoration project. So here is a almost microscopic view to show you the 4 layers of restoration at the Urfo Monastery. So if you maybe I use this schematic diagram. So at the very bottom is the stone. That's when the sculptors will carve the statue out of the mountain cliff, and then they will put the first layer of ground. So this is almost like some kind of glue for you to layer the first layer of lacquer and gold. So, so the statue existed with just this first layer at some point. And there's a lot of debate among historians when this lacquered, the gilded layer added, because according to written records, the original statue might not have a golden appearance. So it might have just been carved out of stone. And then the application of gilding happened centuries later. And as you can see, it was applied several times. So that sort of shows you the history of the site, at least in the later history. All right. Now, a year later, in 2019, I went back to Urval Monastery to check on the progress made on the restoration. Now, the scaffolding was still around, so I got to really go around and look at things again. But there's also something else that caught my eye. And this time, as you can see in this photograph, there was a display of 4 miniature models inside the main temple as part of the restorers' efforts for community outreach and information sharing about what they're doing. So here you can see that they are showing different possibilities of how the restoration can be done. So on one side, you see a model with minimal intervention. So basically, they just consolidate the stone and reuse all the existing gold leaves, because usually that's not enough to cover everything, and just leave it like that. And then at the other extreme is we do absolutely everything, and then you have slightly less or slightly more intervention. So what's really remarkable is that they put this display for the local community to see. And so this is actually quite unusual, because you never find this kind of community outreach at top tier sites like Baotingshan, where everything is so tightly controlled by the central government. And local community has never been part of the concern. But at these kind of second tier sites that's off the beaten track, you see people were a lot more aware of the other stakeholder groups, and also because this conservation project happened after the one at Baotingshan, and they were aware of a lot of the criticism directed at the earlier project. And so they are trying to cover more bases and try to explain what they're doing. And so this is actually quite a remarkable development. And in the Urval Monastery project, the restorers also consider very important to uphold religious and social values that the site exemplify in its long history. And from the technical standpoint, that means there's a need to develop an approach to the Buddha's appearance that fully capture its role both as a historical monument and also an object of devotion for many of its visitors. So in the early example at Baotingshan, it's mainly about the technical aspect that's being captured, and less about the statue being an object of devotion. And here, they're trying to do both. And this is actually a pretty new development, because, and I will talk a bit more about it, because in the development of modern conservation practices in China, religious values have not been really a part of the discussion until very, very recently. And I think for different reasons. So I will return to this later. So, okay. All right, now a year later, in April 2020, and many of you still remember that month after everything got shut down for the pandemic, I got some photos from my colleagues in Hechuan. That's really when they finished the restoration. And I would love to hear your reaction. So this is what they decided to do. All right, so after the restoration, you see that the Buddha looked very bright and shiny. But if you look more closely, you see that certain parts of it has this really new look, like especially the robe, whereas the body has this somewhat texture look, and it's because they use the reused gold leaves for the body in order to preserve the more aged look for the statue, but they also want to show people that also new material was added as part of its new physical state. And then they left everything else as is. They consolidated the stone, but didn't really put any new material on top. And so this is the new look. And it's completed in April 2020. And I haven't had a chance to go back to see what it looks like 3 years later. And let me give you a comparison. And so for the hair, you can see that it's actually just covered in mineral paint, and then some parts, but then the gold leaves have been reused mainly for the flash. Now to wrap up my talk, let me turn back to the question that I posed as the title of my talk. What can restoring Colossal Buddhas like this at Urfu Monastery can do for nature conservancy and cultural preservation? And I would say that it in some way help us to put these two seemingly disparate disciplines together and try to really think about how the two can help us understand preserving nature and also preserving culture as a collective undertaking. So you cannot just preserve culture by itself, or conversely, preserving nature by itself. And so, so that's why I pose this kind of strange question at the outset. And the one outcome that I would like to propose is something called religio-environmental ethics through heritage conservation. This is a way for bringing certain aspects of what we call nature conservancy, or protecting and preserving nature that we know it, with heritage conservation. And there are a couple of key points that I would like to lay out through the example of the Urfu Monastery restoration. Now, first of all, the case at hand exemplifies a major problem in heritage conservation, namely the conceptualization of historical sites as cultural and economic resources, which has led to a difficulty in balancing many fundamental goals in preservation, economic interest, and community needs. In post-socialist China, the dynamics between different stakeholder groups have often been shaped by a top-down, expert-centered approach. But because the site that we study is not a top-tier site, critical to the central government's very nationalistic agenda, you see more tension between these different groups. So what I want to stress here is a sustainability perspective, whereby there is an attempt at achieving a greater balance between conservation objectives and the role of the local community. So, the restorers for the Urfu Monastery project, I think they actually provide a way out, and that is to really involve the local residents in their undertaking. Precisely because there's only so much because the government can do as the official custodian of the past, and it's really up to the local community to do the heavy lifting to preserve past traditions and heritage. So think about a big country like China, where there are thousands of heritage sites. The government just cannot possibly do everything. And so you really need to rely on the local communities. And so what in this project has taught us is that if you actually involve the local community, there's actually a lot of positive benefits to come out of this kind of collaboration. Whereas at some of these more top-down places, like Baotingshan, local community has often been being disenfranchised and being displaced, and it's not good for the long-term conservation of the site as a whole. And so, so that's something that we can learn from this one particular example. Now, to zoom out a little bit, to think about heritage conservation globally, in 2015, UNESCO adopted a new policy to integrate a sustainable development perspective into the processes of World Heritage conservation. So this marks a really big development in the efforts to protect biological and cultural diversity while addressing issues of equity and social justice through inclusive social and economic development. So that's the very idealistic goal that UNESCO or United Nations have put forth. And it will take some time for us to see how far-reaching the impact of this new policy will be on heritage sites around the world. So for the present at least, sustainability is a useful concept with which to understand the situation at Urfu Monastery, where the ongoing restoration of the Colossal Buddha has brought to light many of the potential challenges and opportunities ahead. Now, in a more sustainable mode of engagement between conservation professionals and local community, education, dialogue, and empathy are three key principles. A sustainability perspective can help bridge this gap by fostering mutual understanding between different stakeholder groups through learning and listening to each other's values and viewpoint. So this means that the site manager would find ways to acknowledge the site's past history as a local religious institution and accommodate in-site devotional activities to the extent allowed by state regulations and professional conservation guidelines. And visitors, in turn, would be introduced to basics of cultural heritage and learn to respect the importance of conservation and the site's current status as a heritage property. So more dialogue between the two. And so one example that I find very positive, which can help us to think about a future for a site like Urfa Monastery, is a nearby place called the Laitan Buddha. So some of you might recall from my earlier slides, the Laitan Buddha was restored in 2012. And now it looks really bright and shiny. But actually, they actually did a lot more around the site. So for example, you see in some of the photos I have that they actually turned some of the surroundings into a very beautiful park. And within this park, they actually highlighted some of the really interesting history of the site. So for example, the Great Buddha was right next to a river, and it was flooded many times. And actually, the surrounding landscape was used as a different water level markers. And if you look very closely, there are actually plaques installed since the 17th, 18th century, marking the flooding level of the river. And so they preserve a lot of it, and then they actually make a new monument, sort of showing you how far the water actually rose in the past. So it's actually quite high. And so this way of addressing the site's history as part of its outreach to the community is actually a really good approach. And I was certainly, when I see my colleagues next time in Hechuan, I would tell them, look, you know, your colleagues in Tongnan did it, and probably it's something you might consider. And so that's one example that they can actually consult when they think about the next steps for their own project. Now, the second point I want to make is to really expand the definition of the environment and non-humans in this material-based form of religio-environmental ethics. So the goal is actually to incorporate different worldviews and network of traditional knowledge. So in our case, the Colossal Buddhas have long been part of the surrounding landscape for centuries. They were regarded as alive by their luminous quality and the perceived power in bringing changes to the devotees' lives. From many of the inscriptions that have survived at Urfa Monastery, we learned that people regarded the Buddha as an integral part of the landscape. Hence, we need to really think about it as part of the environment, not something separate. The True River, for example, brought visitors to the site and donations and materials needed for the temple's survival and also maintenance. And in later centuries, many people came to ask the Buddha for help after flooding. So the Buddha's concept of sympathetic resonance is similar to ecological ideas such as vibrant matters. And so, so all these should be considered be a part of a expanded definition of the local environment. And the non-humans are not just limited to plants and animals, but in fact, these creations by humans that also took on the vibrancy of them through the minds of these devotees. So the restoration of Buddhist monuments also calls attention to the place of religious values in heritage conservation in China. So I raised this point earlier. Now let's dive a bit more into it. So, so let me just say a few words about the current laws on the protection of cultural heritage in China. So it's first formulated in '83, and it's mainly for what's called immovable cultural relics, such as architectural complexes, and all of these were considered important to be protected by the state for the historical, artistic, and scientific values. And so these three categories were actually promoted worldwide by UNESCO. So that's following more or less the model set up in Western Europe up to that point. So you can see the conspicuous exclusion of religious values from this legal framework was partly the result of the broader attempt by modern Chinese nation state at nationalizing religion, and also by following the example set by Western countries. Although the central government will not alter the current cultural heritage law anytime soon, there are actually telltale signs of change prompted by the emergent discourse on what's called intangible cultural heritage. So that's another aspect of heritage studies that's also very recent, I would say the last 10, 20 years. So what it means by intangible cultural heritage is something that's not physical. So something such as what you eat, what people practice, like dancing or sports, and it's also becoming very, also extends into religious practices. And most of the countries in the world participate in a new convention called the Intangible Cultural Heritage, but the United States does not join it. And so, so we don't really have a list for the US at this point, but many other countries do. And so if you go to some restaurants, they may actually tell you that certain types of cuisines is considered to be on the list of the intangible cultural heritage for a particular country. And the movement actually have a very big impact on what's called tangible heritage, the kind of statues that we've been talking about. And so in light of this development with the intangible cultural heritage, there's a revision of the guidelines for how conservation has been practiced in China. And this is actually a set of best practices or principles developed by the Chinese government in consultation with the Getty Conservation Institute. So they came up with a revision. And in this particular set of guidelines, they actually list religious significance as constitutive of diversity in the definition of cultural value. Okay, so that may sound all very technical and boring, but I think this is actually a big development because they're trying to make room for religious value, but without actually saying it in the law. And so, so that's actually a very new development. And a lot of the restorations that I have talked about today all signal the move toward that direction. And now finally, the final takeaway that I have in this talk is about people like us, scholars who study these places, that we are actually one of the stakeholder groups, part of the new stakeholder groups. And I also want to encourage a lot of students to think about it, that when you study places or objects in art history, we are actually are important stakeholders in heritage conservation. And through this project, for example, I participated in a lot of ongoing dialogues with different groups, and also trying to share and understand their viewpoints and also push them to think in slightly different ways. And I also participated in a lot of these kind of information sharing and community outreach. As a non-Chinese national, I was also mindful of what I can or what I cannot do. Now, after 3 years of travel restrictions and also rising tensions in US-China relations, that's actually a point that I am uncertain about how to move forward. And that's something I would find out more when I go to China next time. But at the very least, I hope that you see there's actually a way for us to participate in this type of dialogue, not just as observers standing on the sideline. The kind of research I do take me out of the convention boundaries of the humanities. While we do not need to be activists in all instances, we still need to weigh in on some pressing concern of our time. So I hope that through this type of work, I hope that you really try to step back and think about what you can do through your own study. So I would just stop my talk here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Lee. So now we have some time to take questions from both the audience here and on Zoom. I'll probably interplay, with the different questions. So is there any question from the audience here? Yes, Professor Lu. Yeah, can you speak?
Couple questions. So one is that I find the picture you showed us, the four models, is fascinating. So I was wondering, are these four choices, the decision makers will use, or are these four stages of restoration, with which, the first one is the beginning period, or the final one is a completion stage? Because later you showed us the Buddha statue is exactly the same as the final one. So I was wondering, this is this a kind of a process, your four state of
Four
process?
choices, yes. I had the same question, and luckily, my student was with me, and she double-checked with the restorers at the site. They say there's four different choices.
Okay,
And,
I see.
and I think if you look at this one more carefully, the flash is still very smooth and shiny. They didn't opt for that. And in the final version, it's a bit more textured.
Right.
It's a slightly different choice. So actually, they didn't opt for any of these. I think the final choice is somewhere here. But they still are looking for a model where they could actually use as much new material as possible. So it's probably somewhere here.
I see. Okay, just second question is also my curiosity. Why you choose Sichuan as your site? Because Sichuan is not only the province that has a lot of Buddha
Okay.
statues. So
Sure. I think in some way you just have to read my book. I think if you just study the culture behind the making of these Buddhist images, it might not be as obvious. But I think if you want to study the culture alongside the ecological connections, Sichuan is actually isolated from, let me find a map, from central China, because of their all these mountains and also the river networks. So think of it as a very distinct ecosystem, so you can think of it that way. And then it also, because of this isolation due to the geography, you also have a pretty distinct Buddhist culture that flourished there for centuries. And so, so I'm trying to look for a place where that satisfied all these different sets of conditions that I had in mind to write ecological history about these cultural monuments. And it is also quite a independent-minded local culture that you see. And they actually pride themselves of not answering to everything from central government. And so I find it very attractive in studying something that has this very strong local identity. And so it's some of the big consideration for me in choosing this.
All right, we'll take a question from the Zoom. Sorry. So the first question from the Zoom is Eric White's question. Can you describe some of the disagreements and debates between restoration experts, state bureaucrats, temple managers, and local devotees over the aesthetic choices raised by the restoration work, as well as how these reflect different understandings of the value of religious material heritage?
That's a really good question.
Yeah.
And in very general terms, I think it has to do with a conflict in how we understand the function of the Buddha, for example. So for people involved in heritage conservation, especially the technical side, they see it simply as stone that's exposed in a particular ecosystem. And so in order to deal with, to preserve this piece of stone in this kind of environment, you need to do certain things. And so it has a particular function in their mind or a different conceptualization. And so they will try to use the best material in order to preserve it in this state as long as possible. Whereas for some of the members of the local community, for example, who would come to this to worship, if you do all this work, will you undermine the religious efficacy of the Buddha? that it's actually supposed to be luminous and alive, that the Buddha, it's not just a piece of stone sitting there, but in fact it could influence the flooding or influence other environmental factors. And so for them, it's different. And they wanted I think for them, they want to preserve this religious efficacy as much as possible, the religious magical power that these statues supposed to have. And so some of them are conflicted that just don't do anything to the Buddha because it's part of their life for many years. Or some of them say, maybe, if you restore it, that's a way to show that you actually care about the Buddha. And so there are different opinions among the local community what to do. But they all dislike the fact that they won't be able to visit the site for months, if not years, because it's all closed off. And so, so that's in some way one part of their consideration. Now, for the site managers, I think for them, one of the top priorities is really trying to be self-sufficient, that they want the site to be an economic resource. That means it can be a tourism destination. And in order to make it attractive, there has to be something for people to see in order for them to come. And so a sort of rundown, grumpy-looking Buddha might not do the work unless it's so famous that it will attract people. But then there are also other considerations. Maybe it's too new that people might consider it not interesting. I think that's also the view shared by a lot of people coming out of China, that when you go to a country with very long history, you want to see something older. And so they find this kind of restoration too much. They're going too far. And so there are all these different conflicting views that are also part of this tension that I described. And I'm trying to group them according to the three major stakeholder groups. You have the site managers, you have the visitors, and then you have these technologists involved in the restoration. And in a fourth group that I propose that we need to think more about is ourselves, the scholars, the people who study them. And so, so that's roughly my answer to this.
Okay, we have actually 6 more questions on Zoom, but I would like to invite the in-person audience. We have Jamie Kim, Professor Jamie Kim's question. All right.
Yes.
Thank you so much for your fascinating talk. One reason I enjoyed this talk so much was as a historian of late imperial China, when I hear monuments, I think of expenditure of natural resources and human energy, and this is something that's totally different. This sustainable perspective. And I was wondering, I think you mentioned the monastery was founded in 12th century, and I'm assuming it must have gone through several stages of renovation over the years. Do you see any precedence for this sustainability perspective from the people who founded and renovated the site over the years?
In some ways, yes, because sustainability is a very fuzzy concept that you can define in so many different ways. And what I try to do in my book is to define it by the different stakeholder groups. That for site managers, for example, what they try to sustain is the self-sufficiency of the site, that they want to continue the kind of work they do. So basically, from a very economic perspective. And for visitors, it's something less tangible because they are really going for the magical power associated with religious objects and sites. And so they try to sustain it through visitation and through devotional acts. So if we continue to donate to the temple, it will continue to survive and also try to restore them out of respect and also the hope that, you can restore part of its magical power. And for restorers who are more into, they're almost like engineers today, there's a job in front of them and they need to do it in a certain way. So it's very focused on the material state or the what's in front of them. And so that's quite different. And so I'm trying to capture the complexity in how people thought about sustainability in the past through these three stakeholder groups. And so with this example, there's some written records, but not as much. So that's why I wanted to use examples from different regions. And some sites have more information than others. And so, it's a choice. And so here, at least through these different layers of gilded services, you get a certain sense of it, but may not be a complete picture.
Okay, we'll come back to two questions. This is Lucian Sun, PhD candidate from University of Chicago. His question is regarding the relationship between the specific environmental condition in southwest China and the carving and decorative techniques employed by the artists and conservators throughout the history. Since you mentioned that water tends to seep out of the rock and form salt crystallization in this region, was the decorative technique, namely the gold leaf glue by lacquer, a place-specific response to this issue? And is the technique different from other sites?
Yes, in many ways. So throughout Sichuan, there's a place where humidity, it's a fact of life. I guess very similar to Houston or Texas in general. And so, so on top of just humidity, you also have water coming out from particular spots. So at Erfurt Monastery, luckily, they don't have as much water problem as at Baotingshan. But since you're dealing with water, and so they need to find some kind of material that's waterproof. So that's why lacquer became a very viable technique, both in the past as well as in the present.
Okay.
And but lacquer gilding, lacquer-based gilding is also found in other places as well.
Good. We have lots of questions waiting in line, but is there any audience here who would like to ask a question? As Eric is our undergraduate student. Go ahead.
So for the Baotingshan Monument, thank you. For the Baotingshan Monument, you discussed how instead of hiring local companies, they would hire the nation's top officials to restore. But then for other monuments, you also discussed how it's important for local communities to come and restore, and for different aspects, as like what you described for the water level rising. So I'd just like to know when you think it's appropriate for one or the other or both.
Yeah, this is actually a very difficult question. So you need to find the right combination of factors and solutions for a very specific site. And all these conditions also conditioned or framed by the status of the site within the official circle. So I mentioned earlier that the example on the left, the one at Baotingshan, it's a World Heritage Site, so it has the highest recognition in China, so it's recognized by UNESCO as one of the sites on their list. So that means there are all kinds of restrictions applied to it, both domestically and internationally. And so for the Chinese government, they just stick with that top-down, expert-driven approach. That's part of the official set of practices for a long time. Whereas these slightly less high places, there's a bit more wiggle room. And so that's why I find it more interesting to study. And so here, because I think there's also different conflicting interests. So the Hechuan city investment might also think about ways to develop it for tourism, domestic tourism. And so they wanted it to be restored in the most professional way that's possible in China. And so they wanted the top professionals to get involved in this. So that's why they hired people from Beijing for this. And so that was unprecedented up to that point. So, so that's why they took a lot of time thinking about how to actually do it and came up with these 4 models. And they actually carry out the work themselves. And they actually have an action plan and everything. So it's very well documented. So for some of these local undertakings, it might not have as many steps. They didn't even consider the history or study or experiment with different materials and techniques. They just stuck with whatever they knew best to do. And so that's both good and bad in many ways.
Okay, Professor Lee, we have a lot of questions waiting. The next question would be Nicole Santis-Taban asking, when talking about restoration, you mentioned that proper restoration needed to be done layer by layer, starting with clean stone. What do you do with the layer that is removed? Let me read you the next question on Zoom. Logan Ward, the question is, how does the conservation of Laitan Buddha relate to the conservation of the nature environment within which it is built, beyond the building the sustainable relationships between the project and the locals? Can you take these two questions quickly?
Okay, well, I learned about proper way of doing lacquer gilding through the very elaborate study done by the restorers at Baotingshan. So they produced like a 2-volume study, so showing you like all those different materials and different techniques they do, and that's the best result that they came up with. And but also it also has it's in part driven by the nationalistic politics, because they want to show that modern conservation can be done the Chinese way, with Chinese characteristics, just like how they do capitalism. And so I think that's also driven by that. And so this technique has a very long history. So instead of using techniques or materials imported from Italy, they go with the Chinese local kind of solution. And now the second question about the other environmental conditions. So I mentioned the river, about the flooding. I think another way, I was going through the local landscape, maybe that's kind of one way. There's actually a lot of really striking rocks around. And I was thinking about maybe there were some sort of settlements or other ways of using this environment in the past. But it's limited by what the information that I was able to find. Because I mentioned earlier, the Peking University Archaeological Department was involved in the excavation and also some of the survey work. And so I was hoping that through the kind of work they have done, I was able to find a bit more evidence of maybe settlements or even sites where the monks were actually buried. So I'm waiting for them to publish their reports. But if you go further up or down the Chu River, not as much work has been done. So in some way, it's limited the scope of my project. That if there's more excavation being done along the Chu River, I may be able to say more about other environmental conditions that I have not considered so far. And so, so that may take a bit longer to get to some of these questions.
Okay, thank you. Do we have any other question from the audience? Or can I continue a little bit, let me continue. We have a lot of questions from Zoom. And Aik Sai Ko want to ask you, could you tell us more about the involvement of Buddhists, lay or ordained, in the restoration of these statues? Are they consulted? What are the impacts of these restoration on lived religion at these temples? Are these sites now regarded as quote unquote museum sites instead of religious sites?
That's a very good question, which I didn't get to. But that's actually a lot of sites with active religious communities in Hechuan. So one is at a site called Longdoshan, and so this is up on the other side. So we don't have time to talk about it, but you can see that that's how some of the local deities have been restored by a local artisan. So I was there when he was applying the paint, and certainly he wasn't doing it by following the guidelines from the central government. He was just doing it his own way. And then there's another very interesting development at the Urfel Monastery, because behind the historical part, there's actually a thriving Buddhist community. And that part was run by a group of monks trained at Ermeishan, and they have all kinds of activities going on. And this group is not involved in the discussion. I think they were excluded for different reasons. And so I think that's actually quite an interesting development in itself. So, because the site has the more modern part and then the historical part. And a lot of the restoration happened within the historical part. So that's why they were using it as a way to exclude these community.
Do we have a question from the audience here? Let's do a couple more questions here. These are actually interesting questions. Here, Le would like to ask you what motivated the choice of reusing the older material to give a textured look to face and body of this Buddha statue? Was it because they considered that old material sacred and therefore could not be thrown away? That's one question. There's another question from Kathleen Boone. She wants to ask, she's heard about the instances of religious restoration by locals that have done permanent damage to the original pieces. Considering the cultural significance of the Buddhas, are there conflicts over the worry that the statues could be ruined during restoration versus the need to restore the statues? I think that you addressed some of that.
Yeah, I have on the screen this local artisan who was repainting some of the local deities at Longdoshan. I think this is a really good slide to illustrate what's being called pious vandalism. So it's actually a term coined pretty early on in the 20th century by people who are interested in heritage conservation, that they were actually worried that people like these would actually ruin the historical and religious values.
I think a lot of art historians worry about this. We like older things, and we like original things.
Yeah, like, this guy was just painting over, paint that's damaged by the water sipping out from the cliff. And so, so that's actually a term in heritage conservation. Now, why we use some of these older pieces? It's actually a really interesting question. And I think it also has to do with how modern conservation came about. So it actually has a very strong base in Italy, that there's a school associated with this very important painter and practitioner named Cesare Brandi. And so he's sort of the father of modern conservation, like in Italy and also through the Western world. And one of the key arguments he has is that, so you need to, so as long as you can preserve this idea about a work of art, it doesn't matter what material you use. And so so whatever you do to the work, so beyond the initial moment of creation, you also need to incorporate that as part of its history. So as you can see, there's a very strong appeal to actually to include materials that has accrued over the long period of a work's lifetime in the restoration. And so, so it makes a lot of sense in the mind of these restorers to actually reuse the older gold leaves as part of the new restoration.
Right, Professor Ariel Washington has a question.
Hi, thanks very much for your talk. You touched on this a little bit already, but at the end of your talk, you mentioned how heritage conservation can be a model for ecological conservation as well. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about how that relates to how images interact with the broader environment. For example, large Buddhas next to rivers. Is this a model for using cultural heritage for, water management, laws, or, different ways of thinking about actual entire ecological systems as part of that as well?
Sure. How much time do we have? Make it short. 2 more questions? Okay. I think it's quite case specific. when I do this kind of research, I was trying to see how much I can, how much material or evidence I have for a particular case. If I can actually go very deep historically, I would try to maybe go a couple more steps and try to reconstruct maybe like this earlier question about past understanding of sustainability. But sometimes you don't have the data to really go with it. Then maybe I can go forward and think about what solutions can be done. And so I think your question about how to bring these two, nature conservancy and cultural preservation together, it's actually really critical. And I cannot give you a definite answer to it because I don't think there's one size fit all type of solution to it. And so it will be more case by case. And so that's maybe a short answer to your question. And also the conceptualization of man-made objects as part of the non-living environment. And I think that's actually the part that art historians can do because we do have the tools to really understand the meanings attributed to these creations. And I think if we put it within a larger context, not just the historical, but in fact the environmental, there's actually quite a lot we can add. I think, for example, in India, there's so many examples of how water has been part of a site's history. I think that can be really a great potential for a lot of studies of this kind.
All right, we'll take the last question from Zoom audience, and thank you so much, the Zoom audience, for all your questions. Area Diao would like to ask you, he's curious, do all restoration project for Colossal Buddhas in China aim to give the Buddhas a golden appearance?
Seems to be the trend. So China, like the three that I study, all have this golden look. And I would say that a lot of these Buddhas elsewhere also have this very golden, very shiny appearance. And it also tied to some of the ideas about what religious deities look like. So if they're important, they are they have this golden look as a way to show light, that they can actually emit light. I think that's a really important attribute for Buddha and Bodhisattvas as a way to show that they are divine. And so it's tied to these kind of religious ideas, and to make it practical, to really show it. So basically the gold color is actually a really important way. And I think it also has a lot to do with restoration of ancient monuments, like in the Mediterranean world. A lot of the Roman sculptures are really bright, painted with bright colors. And so it's something that we're not so used to. I think we have this kind of 19th century romantic view of the past, that it has to be subdued and kind of has this very aged look that we wanted. But it's probably not the case around the world. So.
Okay, great. This is a very stimulating discussion. Thank you so much for the audience here and the audience on Zoom. Let's give it applause to So there are two more questions. I already take a screenshot. So, I encourage the audience to communicate with our speaker, maybe by email, and we can continue this.
Yeah, sure.
All right.
I'll be happy to
Thank
answer
you
more
so
questions.
much for
Thank
coming.
you.
Yeah, all right, good.
A lot of questions.